Jarek Myles awoke to the harsh hum of the Xintari prison complex. His bones ached, stiff and cold from a night spent on the unforgiving floor of his cell. The damp air clung to his skin like a second layer of grime. His mouth was dry, the taste of rusted metal and stale air lingering on his tongue. He reached up, rubbing his face with weary hands, the familiar weight of despair pressing on his chest. The once vibrant world he had known was now nothing more than a fading memory, swallowed by the cold, suffocating grasp of the Xintari Empire. The metal door to his cell creaked open with a groan, a sharp contrast to the dull silence that had taken over the prison. A Xinthar officer, his sleek alien face blank and emotionless, stepped inside. His footsteps were silent, but the faintest hum of his biotechnological armor resonated in the air like a predator circling its prey. Jarek didn't flinch. He'd learned long ago that resisting was a futile exercise. The Xintari controlled everything, from the air they breathed to the very thoughts that flickered in their minds. Or so they thought. "Get up, human," the officer ordered, his voice devoid of empathy, a mechanical tone laced with indifference. Jarek's legs trembled as he pushed himself to his feet. His eyes blurred with exhaustion, but he kept his posture rigid, the muscles in his back screaming for relief. He stood at attention, though he could feel the weight of the chains that clamped around his wrists, each movement a reminder of his status as nothing more than an animal to be controlled. Another day, another task, he muttered under his breath, knowing the officer wouldn't respond to such insolence. It had been this way for years now, the endless cycle of work, torment, and silence. The officer's cold gaze lingered for a moment longer before he turned and gestured for Jarek to follow. Jarek did, shuffling along the narrow, dimly lit corridor that twisted through the bowels of the prison complex. The walls were cold, slick with condensation, and every step he took echoed in the emptiness, a stark reminder that his freedom, his future, was forever bound to this prison. The prisoners were cattle to the Xintari, kept in metal cages, herded to work, broken when necessary. The soldiers moved among them like shadows, their glowing eyes scanning for any sign of rebellion. Jarek had seen many attempt to fight back, their resistance crushed swiftly and without mercy. What hope did they have against an empire so vast, so technologically advanced? The Xintari ruled with an iron fist, and the humans were little more than tools to be used and discarded. But there was something stirring in Jarek. A flicker of defiance, buried deep within, refused to die, despite the years of torment. The songs, the whispers of melody and rhythm that had begun to fill the air, had ignited something in him. It wasn't just the sound, it was the spirit behind it. The humans, despite their suffering, had begun to sing. The faintest melodies echoed through the prison, rising from the depths of despair, like birds taking flight from the ashes of their destruction. As they passed through another corridor, Jarek heard it again, a soft hum, a song. The sound was faint, barely audible above the clang of chains and the footsteps of guards, but it was there. It was always there now. The humans were singing to survive, singing to remember, a simple tune, a hymn, something from the past. And though Jarek could feel the ache in his chest when he heard it, he couldn't help but feel a surge of hope. Hope that something, anything, could disrupt the silence that the Xintari had imposed on them. They arrived at the work area. The cavernous room stretched out before him, filled with the hum of machinery, the clang of metal, the hiss of alien weapons being repaired. Prisoners were scattered about, shackled to machines, performing tasks under the watchful eyes of the Xinthar officers. The air was thick with the stench of oil, sweat, and fear. Jarek's hands itched to break free, to raise his fist, to tear the chains from his body. But he knew better than to dream of freedom. "Start working, human," the Xinthar officer barked, shoving Jarek toward a workstation. The alien didn't wait for a response, already moving on to the next captive. Jarek stared down at the mechanical parts before him. He wasn't a technician, but the work was simple enough. They kept the humans busy, their hands occupied, so they wouldn't have time to think, to dream. But Jarek's thoughts were already elsewhere. They had to be. His mind was the last free thing he had. From the corner of his eye, Jarek saw a group of prisoners gathered near the back of the room. Their heads were low, their bodies hunched, but Jarek recognized the faint movement of their mouths. They were singing again, softly at first, just a low murmur. But Jarek could hear the longing in the melody, a call for something greater than survival, a call for freedom. He couldn't resist. Without thinking, his lips parted and the words tumbled out, soft at first, hesitant, but then they grew, swelling with a force that he hadn't felt in years. The music. It was so simple, so human, and yet it felt like the most powerful thing in the world. It was the sound of resistance, of life, of defiance. Around him, the other prisoners began to hum along, a chorus growing louder with each passing moment. It wasn't much, just a few notes at first, but it was enough to send a ripple through the room. The guards heard it too. They stopped, their heads turning toward the sound, their eyes narrowing with suspicion. The song spread like wildfire, jumping from one prisoner to the next. Jarek's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't know what this music could do, but he knew that it was something. It was something the Xintari hadn't anticipated. It was something that could break the silence. Enough! A Xinthar officer stepped forward, his glowing eyes blazing with fury. He raised a weapon, the hum of energy vibrating through the air. The song faltered for a moment, fear creeping into the notes. But then, just as quickly, the sound rose again, louder this time, defiant. Jarek stepped forward, his voice merging with the others, becoming one with the collective power of the humans around him. They had nothing left but each other. They had nothing left but this song. The Xinthar officer hesitated, the weapon wavering in his hand. He looked at the prisoners, confused by the emotion, by the force that was rising before him. He didn't understand. Music wasn't supposed to be dangerous. It was just noise, right? But that was the thing. The Xintari didn't understand humans. They had underestimated them, underestimated the power of their emotions, the power of their music. The officer's confusion was met with a surge of sound. The song, raw and pure, filled the room. It wasn't just a melody anymore. It was a declaration, a rebellion. The officer raised his weapon again, but this time his hand trembled, and for the first time in years, Jarek smiled. The music wasn't just lifting their spirits. It was starting to break the Xintari's control, and that was only the beginning. The song lingered in the air like a dream half remembered. The last note still vibrated in Jarek's chest as he stepped back, his pulse hammering in his ears. The Xinthar officer was frozen, weapon in hand, unsure whether to strike or retreat. The silence that followed the song was thick and heavy, as if the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something, anything to happen. But Jarek could feel it, deep in his bones. This wasn't just a song anymore. It was a challenge. The officer's fingers twitched, his eyes flicking from the prisoners to the weapon in his hand. His confusion was palpable, but it wasn't fear, not yet. He didn't understand what had just happened. The music hadn't been a simple distraction. It had torn through his composure like a blade through cloth, and he didn't know how to respond. The human spirit, once crushed beneath the weight of chains, had erupted, and now its song was reverberating through the room, catching everyone in its pull. Jarek could see the hesitation in the officer's stance, the momentary lapse in control. The other Xinthar guards around the room had frozen too, their eyes scanning the prisoners, searching for an explanation they couldn't find. But that was the thing. There was no explanation for this. The humans weren't supposed to be a threat. They were weak, subjugated, nothing more than animals to be caged. And yet, here they were, their song becoming their power. Jarek's mind raced, but he knew one thing for sure. This was the opening they had been waiting for. The Xinthar had made a grave mistake, underestimating the human capacity for resilience. They had always believed that humans were broken, that their spirits could never be mended. But now, in the very heart of their prison, humanity was proving them wrong. The rebellion had begun, and it wasn't with weapons or force, but with something far simpler, more profound. It was music. "Sing," Jarek whispered to the others around him, his voice barely audible over the still air. He didn't have to say it loud. They already knew. The prisoners, their eyes wide with uncertainty and hope, hesitated for only a moment before they began to hum again, soft at first, like the fluttering of wings, but then the sound grew stronger, more confident, until it filled the room like a river breaking through a dam. The Xinthar officer's weapon trembled in his grip as the sound wrapped around him. His mouth opened as if to shout a command, but the words died in his throat. The song wrapped itself around his mind, seeping through the cracks in his mental fortifications. His knees buckled slightly, and for a moment it seemed as though he might collapse. The effect was subtle but undeniable. Like a shadow slowly creeping up a wall, his control was slipping. His face twisted in confusion, then in fear, as he tried to make sense of what was happening. Jarek's heart raced. This was more than he'd expected. The song wasn't just lifting the spirits of the prisoners, it was destabilizing the alien forces, exploiting their deepest vulnerability. The Xinthar, with their advanced technology and cold mechanical efficiency, were unprepared for the chaos that emotion could unleash. "Move!" Jarek barked, his voice low but urgent. The time for hesitation was over. The prisoners were ready now, their voices a force that could no longer be contained. They surged forward, past the still shaking officer, using the confusion to break through the guard's line. The resistance was no longer just a flickering flame. It was a blaze, catching everything in its path. The officer, struggling to regain his composure, finally raised his weapon, aiming it at the closest prisoner. But the sound of their collective voices, rising like a tidal wave, drowned out his commands. The weapon in his hand shook, his resolve crumbling under the emotional weight of the music. His mind was unraveling, and all he could do was stare, helpless. The other guards, too, stood frozen, trapped in the invisible web of human emotion that had tangled them up. Fear had taken root, and it was spreading faster than any virus. "Now!" Jarek commanded, stepping forward and grabbing a metal bar that lay nearby. He swung it with precision, knocking the nearest guard off balance. The prisoners, emboldened by the song and the opening created by the officer's failure, sprang into action. The clatter of chains and boots echoed through the room as they charged, the Xinthar officers stumbling backward, their disciplined formation falling apart like a house of cards. Jarek's breath was ragged, but the adrenaline coursing through his veins fueled him. His mind was focused, but his thoughts kept returning to the song. The music had shattered the Xintari's control. The mental walls they had so carefully built to suppress human emotions were crumbling under the weight of something as simple as a melody. Could it really be this easy? Could music truly be their weapon? The room was chaos, but Jarek couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the cusp of something monumental. He wasn't the only one thinking it. The prisoners around him were shouting, singing louder, their voices blending together in a powerful chorus of rebellion. Lyra, a former musician turned leader of the resistance, stood beside him, her face a mask of determination. "They won't be able to handle this for long," she said, her voice steady despite the mayhem surrounding them. "We need to act quickly before they figure out what's happening." "I know," Jarek replied, glancing over at her. Her eyes, usually so calm and composed, were now alive with the fire of conviction. Lyra had been the one to first recognize the power of music, the first to suggest it as a form of resistance, and now it seemed she had been right all along. The prisoners surged forward, and the Xintari soldiers, still reeling from the effects of the music, struggled to regain control. But it was no use. The song had done its work. The Xintari were no longer in control of the situation. The rebellion was in full swing. But as Jarek and the others broke free from their shackles, as the sound of their song reverberated through the prison complex, a thought nagged at the back of his mind. This was just the beginning. What if the Xintari, when they finally realized what was happening, retaliated with even greater force? What if they learned to counter the power of the song? As they made their way toward the exit, Jarek stole a glance back at the prison, a place that had once seemed like an unbreakable fortress. He had never believed music could be their salvation, but now, as he felt the stirrings of something greater than himself, he wondered if the universe had underestimated humanity's ability to fight back. If music could break their chains, what else could they achieve? The sound of rebellion had just begun. The air was thick with tension. Jarek Myles could feel it pressing against his skin, heavy and suffocating. The music had done its work. It had torn apart the Xintari control, shattered their mental barriers, and left the Empire teetering on the edge of collapse. But even now, as the last notes of the human song echoed through the dark corridors of the prison complex, Jarek couldn't shake the feeling that they were far from winning. The Xintari were too powerful, too resilient, to fall to something as simple as a melody. The broken chains lay scattered across the floor like remnants of a forgotten past, and the once pristine halls of the prison were now filled with the noise of footsteps, shouting prisoners, and the harsh clatter of alien weaponry. The Xintari soldiers, though shaken, had regrouped quickly, their training and technology still formidable. But the cracks in their empire were starting to show, and Jarek could see it in their eyes. Fear, uncertainty. For the first time, they didn't have the upper hand. "We need to move faster." Lyra's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and focused. She was at Jarek's side, her face streaked with dirt, but alight with a spark he hadn't seen before. It wasn't just determination. There was something deeper in her gaze now, a fire that had ignited from the ashes of their oppression. Jarek nodded, his throat tight with the knowledge of how close they were to the precipice. "I know. The longer we stay here, the greater the risk of detection. We need to find a way out. Now." They had learned the hard way that the Xintari had underestimated them. The song had been their first weapon, and it had opened the door to something greater. The prison complex had fallen, but the rebellion was only just beginning. Their next step was clear: free the other prisoners, rally the enslaved workers across the empire, and turn the tide of war. But Jarek couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling in his chest. The Xintari had been silent for too long. They were planning something. The group moved quickly through the corridors. their footsteps muffled by the layers of ash and dust that had settled over everything. The air was thick with the smell of burning metal and the sharp tang of fear. The distant hum of the alien machinery echoed in the walls, a constant reminder of how outmatched they were. But Jarek felt something else, too, a vibration beneath the surface, a low, almost imperceptible pulse that seemed to echo through the bones of the building. It was a frequency he'd learned to recognize over the years. The Xintari were reconfiguring their weapons, preparing for retaliation. "Jarek," Lyra whispered, pulling him to the side. Her hand was warm on his arm, her grip tight with urgency. "There's something more going on here. I've heard rumors, whispers among the prisoners. The Xintari might not just be planning a counterattack. They might have a way to stop the music." A chill ran down Yarek's spine. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The hum of the ship, the distant sounds of shouting prisoners, the beating of his own heart. "How?" he breathed, barely able to find his voice. "I don't know," Lyra admitted, her voice strained. "But the last few days I've seen a shift. There are guards acting differently, less certain. They're guarding the communication center more closely, and the prisoners are being moved to different sectors. Something's happening, Jarek." The weight of her words hung in the air, thick and foreboding. The Xintari had always relied on their mental control, their ability to suppress any form of rebellion. But if Lyra was right, if they had a way to counteract the power of the human song, then everything they'd fought for, every sacrifice made, might have been in vain. "We need to find out what they're hiding," Jarek said, his voice a low growl. "Stay close, and don't let anyone see us." Lyra nodded, her eyes hardening with the same determination that burned within him. Together, they led the small group through the winding hallways, staying to the shadows, avoiding the occasional Xintari patrol. The tension in the air was unbearable, the feeling of being hunted always lingering just behind them. The song had given them hope, but now the darkness had returned, and it felt heavier than before. They reached the heart of the complex, a sprawling chamber filled with alien tech, screens flickering with garbled data, communication terminals blinking with static, the center of their enemies' operations, the place where all the Empire's secrets converged. This was where the truth would be revealed. Jarek's mind raced as he approached the terminal, his fingers brushing over the smooth surface of the alien controls. He had no idea how any of it worked, but his gut told him this was where they would find the answers. "What if we're walking into a trap?" Lyra asked, her voice barely above a whisper, her gaze sweeping the room nervously. Jarek shook his head. "We don't have a choice. We need to know what they're planning. If they have a way to stop the music, we have to stop them before they use it." He reached out, tapping the terminal with a steady hand. The screen flickered, then came to life, displaying streams of alien text, incomprehensible to the human eye. But with a few swift motions, Jarek was able to access a file. The words "Project Resonance" flashed across the screen, and Jarek's breath caught in his throat. "What is it?" Lyra asked, leaning over his shoulder. Jarek's eyes scanned the file quickly. "It's a frequency-based weapon. It looks like they've been studying human vocal patterns, trying to reverse engineer the music, disrupt its frequencies. They're developing something that can block the resonance." The implications hit Jarek like a punch to the gut. The Xintari had been studying their music all along, turning it into a weapon against them. They had known about the human resistance all this time, but instead of fighting it with force, they had decided to dismantle it from within. "They've been preparing for this," Jarek muttered, the weight of the realization settling heavily on his shoulders. "And now they're ready to use it." Lyra looked grim. What do we do now? Jarek stared at the terminal for a moment longer, then turned to face the group. The rebellion wasn't over. It had only just begun. We find a way to fight back. They think they can silence us with frequencies, but we're human. We'll find a way to make them listen. The moment was pregnant with tension, the growing awareness of the battle ahead filling the room. But even as Jarek spoke, a part of him couldn't shake the feeling that the Xintari were already 2 steps ahead. And as the faint hum of the alien tech pulsed through the walls, he couldn't help but wonder, what would they do when the song was no longer enough? They had to move quickly. They had to act now. But as they turned to leave the terminal room, a loud crash echoed from the far hallway. The door slammed open, and a squad of Xinthar officers stormed in, weapons raised. They had been discovered. "Time's up," Jarek whispered, his voice low, filled with both dread and resolve. The final test had begun. The Xinthar officers moved like shadows in the dim light, their sleek armored bodies cutting through the haze of smoke and dust in the hallway. The door to the terminal room had barely slammed shut when Jarek heard their boots. He didn't need to turn to know they were closing in. Their presence was suffocating, their footsteps rhythmic and purposeful. The pulse of the alien tech, the soft whir of their weapons charging, filled the room like an ominous countdown. Lyra's hand was tight on Jarek's arm, her breath shallow. "We can't fight them all," she whispered, her voice a low hiss of urgency. "We need a plan." Jarek didn't answer at first. His mind raced, sifting through the possibilities. The file on the terminal, the discovery of Project Resonance, the way the Xintari had been studying the frequencies, working to neutralize humanity's weapon. He had no illusions. This wasn't going to be easy. The Xintari were ready for them. They were using human music against them, and now they had the upper hand. They would silence the song if they could, suffocate the last breath of resistance with the weight of their technology. But Jarek couldn't let that happen. Not now. Not after all they had fought for. The plan had to be precise. It had to be calculated. He looked over at Lyra, her face grim but resolute. They needed to act quickly. "We need to divide them, create confusion. We can't fight them head on, not with our numbers. But if we separate them, we might stand a chance." Lyra nodded, her eyes flicking over the room, taking in their options. "We can use the pipes, the vents. There's a crawl space that runs along the walls. It leads to the central control room." Jarek followed her gaze. The vents, small, narrow, and crawling with dust and grease, they had barely noticed them in the chaos of the prison. But now, they could be their lifeline, a way to outmaneuver the Xintari and reach the heart of their enemy's operations. "That's our way in. We'll split into teams. Some of us will head to the central control room, take out their communications and monitoring systems. The rest," he hesitated, feeling the weight of his decision. "We'll create a diversion. We draw them away. We use our voices again. But this time, it won't just be a song. It'll be a signal. A call." Lyra's eyes sparkled with the same fierce energy that had carried them this far. "And we use their technology against them?" Jarek nodded. "Exactly. We've been broadcasting our music through their system, but now we can infiltrate it, redirect their frequencies, disrupt their systems. When we hit their command center, we'll hit them hard." They had no time to waste. The Xintari were closer now, their voices echoing down the corridor, their low growls of frustration ringing in Jarek's ears. The humans had exposed their weakness, emotions, raw and untamable. And now it was time to use that knowledge to finish what they had started. Jarek turned to the group of prisoners, his voice firm but low. "This is it. We move out in 10 minutes. Stay silent, stay focused, and above all, stay together. We're not just escaping. We're bringing this empire to its knees. Let's remind them why they never should have underestimated us." There was no applause, no cheering. But there was something stronger. Resolve. The prisoners, once broken and trembling, now stood tall, their eyes hard with determination. They had heard the song, felt its power. Now they were ready to make that power something real, something lethal. Jarek led the group to the vent, his heart pounding as he moved swiftly through the darkness. The Xintari's patrols were predictable. They moved in sets of threes, their glowing eyes darting through the hallways, scanning for any sign of rebellion. The humans, on the other hand, had learned to be anything but predictable. They slithered into the vents one by one, their breaths shallow, their bodies curled into tight spaces as they moved toward their goal. The sound of the Xintari's boots faded as they made their way down the hall, and Jarek exhaled slowly, the tension beginning to ease. But he knew it wouldn't last. The next part of their plan required precision and timing. Lyra led the way, her small frame sliding into the narrow pipe first. Jarek followed, pushing his body through the dusty air vents, feeling the grit and grease cling to his skin. The crawl space was tight, cramped, but they had no choice. The passageway led them directly beneath the Xintari's control room, a place of power, of manipulation. Jarek's pulse quickened. They were close now. As they neared the heart of the enemy's operation, Jarek could hear the low hum of Xintari machinery vibrating through the walls. His fingers tightened on the edge of the metal grate, and he could almost taste the anticipation in the air. The Xintari were powerful, yes, but they had forgotten one thing. Humans had survived without them for centuries. Humans didn't need technology to fight. They had their hearts, their minds, and their songs. When they reached the control room, Jarek signaled to Lyra. They had made it. It was time. The prisoners who had been with them in the vents dispersed, taking positions in key areas. They had to disable the communication systems quickly. Jarek glanced at Lyra and Taryn, who had been silently preparing their next move. "This is it," Jarek whispered, his breath ragged. "We take control of their frequency. We fight them with our voices again." The air in the control room was thick with the hum of alien tech. They had infiltrated the Xintari's core. The hum of the machinery, the cold metallic scent, the sharp edge of tension, it was all pushing Jarek forward. They could feel it. The final battle was within reach. He turned to Taryn, who had a small portable device in hand, human-made, yet capable of infiltrating the alien systems. "This is it," Jarek said, his voice low but urgent. "We hack their system, redirect the frequencies. If we can broadcast our song through their network, we can collapse their empire." Taryn nodded and moved swiftly to the main console, his fingers flying across the keys. The rest of the prisoners, standing guard, readied themselves. The Xintari would come soon, and when they did, they would be ready. The device hummed to life. A signal flickered on the screen. Jarek's breath hitched. This was the moment of truth. Would the song break their captors once and for all, or would it fail, leaving them at the mercy of the alien empire? A loud crash echoed from the hallway. The Xintari were coming. And then the music began. Jarek's heart beat in time with the rising chorus of humanity's resistance. The music filled the control room, flowing through the network, crashing against the walls of Xintari control. As the song reached its peak, the sound reverberated throughout the entire complex, shifting frequencies and causing chaos in the alien systems. Outside the control room, Xintari officers stumbled, their movements erratic as the music hit them like a tidal wave, crashing through their mental defenses. The rebellion had gone beyond their expectations. The Xintari were no longer in control. The humans were. But the fight was far from over. The question now was whether the Xintari could ever regain their composure, if they could learn to fight against the power of something so simple, yet so profound, the human spirit. The air vibrated with the power of their song, pulsing through the alien systems, cascading through the walls of the Xintari Empire's stronghold. Jarek Myles could feel it deep in his chest, the hum of his heartbeat syncing with the resonance of humanity's collective defiance. It was not just the notes in the air. It was the very essence of humanity's will to survive, to overcome. They had not just infiltrated the heart of the Empire. They had become its pulse, its undoing. The Xintari were crumbling under the weight of something they had never even considered a threat. Jarek's eyes flicked to the console, where Terran's fingers moved with precision, his face illuminated by the flickering holographic readouts. The machine hummed louder as it worked, feeding back to the central system, its resonance growing stronger, more chaotic. It was working. The frequencies that had once been the Xintari's weapon were now their bane. The interference spread, causing the alien command center to fracture, a network of chaos within the once monolithic structure. Lyra stood beside him, her face a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration, her eyes burning with the fire of someone who had seen the impossible become real. The music had not only broken the chains of the prisoners, but had shattered the very idea that the Xintari were invincible. Their unity, their will, their belief in the song had become their weapon. But they were not done yet. The final blow was still to come. "We're close," Lyra whispered, her voice taut with expectation. "The whole system is unraveling." Jarek nodded, though he could feel a flicker of doubt gnawing at him. The Xintari were formidable, and despite their apparent collapse, they still held immense power. He could see it in their final, frantic attempts to recover control, their weapons charging, their officers moving toward the center. It wasn't over. Not yet. They still had the will to fight. The song reverberated through the facility, like a heartbeat growing stronger, louder, more insistent. It was more than just sound now. It was an emotion, a force that carried the weight of everything humanity had endured. The Xintari were suffocating under it, each note tearing at the fragile walls of their control, digging into their minds, scrambling their senses. Jarek could see it in their eyes when they finally arrived, led by the Empire's highest commander, a towering figure of cold authority. He stepped into the control room, his eyes flicking over the rebels with the cold gaze of someone who had long considered humanity insignificant. "You think your pathetic songs will stop us?" His voice was low, mocking, laced with arrogance. "Your music is nothing. It is chaos. It cannot defeat the might of the Xintari." Jarek didn't flinch. The air around him felt heavy, the tension so thick it could suffocate a person. "Your might is based on fear, Commander," Jarek replied, his voice calm, resolute. "But fear only works when you have control. We took that from you." The commander sneered, his hand raising to silence Jarek. "You think this noise has any meaning? The Xintari will rebuild. We are eternal." Jarek met the commander's gaze, steady and unwavering. "Eternal? You may have built your empire on dominance and technology, but you forgot something that no weapon can account for: the human spirit." His words echoed in the room, cutting through the commander's arrogance like a blade. "You've underestimated us, Commander. You thought we were just weak, enslaved, broken, but you were wrong." The Xintari commander's face twisted into a grimace, and in that moment, Jarek saw the true panic in his eyes. It wasn't just fear of the rebellion. It was the realization that humanity had unlocked something his empire could never contain: music. A simple, pure force that transcended technology, that bypassed all the defenses they had worked so hard to build. The music swelled, rising like a wave, the sound becoming both a physical and psychological force. The walls of the control room began to tremble, the vibrations shaking loose debris and sparks from the walls. The Xintari soldiers faltered, their weapons trembling in their hands. Their resolve was slipping, their mental defenses breaking under the strain of the sound. It wasn't just the frequency anymore. It was the combined will of the human spirit. The song had become their weapon, their defense, their answer to oppression. Lyra's voice joined the others, rising in unison, each note carrying the weight of centuries of suffering and hope. She had always known that music could be powerful, but even she hadn't anticipated this. The rebels' voices were no longer just an expression of resistance. They were a force that reshaped the very air they breathed. The sound wasn't just tearing apart the Xintari's mental defenses. It was breaking their unity, unraveling their beliefs. The commander shouted orders, but his voice was drowned out by the rising crescendo. His hands grasped at his head, as though trying to hold himself together as the human song unraveled everything he had built. His soldiers, once so disciplined, were now turning on each other. The music had found its way into their minds, dragging out emotions they had long suppressed. Fear, doubt, and anger flared in their eyes as they looked at each other, unsure who to trust. The empire was crumbling, not because of weapons, not because of force, but because of something as simple and profound as a song. Jarek stepped forward, his gaze never leaving the commander. "This is your empire, Commander. This is the strength you relied on. But what happens when the very thing you used to control is turned against you? What happens when you can no longer silence the voices of the oppressed?" The commander's lips trembled, his eyes wild with desperation. "You'll never win. We are everywhere. You can't." The rest of his words were lost in the music. The song had reached its peak, filling the room with an overwhelming surge of power. The Xintari officers, unable to cope with the mental onslaught, collapsed to their knees, their bodies convulsing in the grip of the sound. The empire had faltered, not with a bang, not with a blast, but with a simple human act of resistance. The commander staggered back, his knees giving way as the song tore through his resolve. "Stop it," he gasped, his voice weak. "Stop the music." Jarek watched him fall, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what had been lost. But there was no time for mercy now. The rebellion had reached its end game. Lyra stepped forward, her voice still strong despite the strain. "It's over, Commander. The Xintari Empire is finished." The sound of humanity's song filled the room one final time, louder than before, sweeping through the corridors and far beyond the walls of the prison. The music carried with it the weight of generations of human suffering, their dreams of freedom, their unbroken spirit. It was the sound of rebellion, of victory, of a people who would never be silenced again. As the last note reverberated through the control room, Jarek stood in the center, his heart pounding in his chest. The Xintari Empire had fallen, not because of technology, not because of force, but because of something the Xintari could never comprehend: humanity's ability to create, to inspire, and to fight for what was right. The galaxy would remember the humans not as slaves, but as the ones who had torn down an empire with nothing but their voices. And for Jarek Myles, the song had been more than just a weapon. It had been the key to a future where humanity was no longer at the mercy of any empire. The echo of humanity's song continued to resonate in the silence that followed. And in that silence, Jarek knew the galaxy would never forget the power of the human spirit.